Welcome to the deep dive. We've taken a massive stack of sources, detailed police reports, intense psychological profiles, and records spanning months of investigation. And our goal today is to cut through all that noise, extract the key insights, and deliver you the complete, nuanced narrative of what is really one of the most baffling and destructive crime sprees in modern Swedish history.
Today's deep dive is into a terrifying saga of revenge, all focused on the Uppsala area. The narrative is defined by a series of brutal, seemingly random murders that initially sent the investigation down this highly intellectual yet completely false rabbit hole. We're tracking not just the victims, but the total psychological collapse of a brilliant woman driven to seek absolute freedom through systematic destruction.
So our mission is to untangle this complex web. We want to understand the lives of the victims, trace the really dramatic shift in the police investigation from, a missing person case to a full-blown murder spree, and ultimately reveal the single core motive that linked every brutal act, a motive rooted in decades-old personal trauma. This is a story about how the world of elite academia can sometimes conceal the most toxic and dangerous family secrets. Okay, so let's start at the beginning. The investigation kicks off in late September with the abrupt disappearance of a very specific type of man. Professor Ulrik Hindersten is a celebrated Renaissance scholar living in Kobo, and his academic niche wasn't broad history. He was obsessed with Petrarch, the 14th century Italian poet, and specifically Petrarch's muse and idealized love object, Laura.
And that academic obsession is the absolute foundation of the emotional devastation we're about to see unfold. Hindersten named his own daughter, Laura Hindersten, after Petrarch's idealized, unattainable woman. Our sources highlight that the daughter grew up feeling like a concept rather than a flesh-and-blood person. Her identity was predefined by her father's scholarship. She was an object of study or admiration, but never a real person to him.
Right. And this immediately colors the very first interaction police have with the younger Laura Hindersten when they come to interview her about her missing father. Detective Asa Lance Anderson's report notes an immediate sense of coldness. Laura was aggressively dismissive and just devoid of any expected distress.
The conversation was stunningly brief and cutting. When Lance Anderson mentioned the hard work of the missing persons unit, Laura replied without hesitation that the work must be depressing, banal.
Wow.
Yeah. She wasn't simply uninterested in cooperating. She was using this intellectual condescension to assert her superiority over the very people who were trying to find her father.
And despite maintaining a polite, professional demeanor, Lance Anderson felt that immediate, sharp sense of dread. Based on her experience, she knew the professor wasn't going to be found alive. Our sources confirm this pessimism was rooted in the time that had already passed, 3 days by the end of September. Once a meticulous man like Ulrik Hindersten, who played chess and organized his life by the clock, vanishes without warning. Well, the chances of a good outcome just plummet.
And it's so crucial to note that Hindersten's interests, chess and Petrarch, are the two intellectual pursuits that essentially suffocated his daughter's life. Chess is structure, it's strategy, cold logic.
Right.
And Petrarch is this idealized, distant, often agonizing emotion, but all filtered through the written word. So Laura was just caught between these two rigid frameworks imposed by her father. The fact that the entire investigation starts with the disappearance of this specific type of intellectual control freak, that's the key to understanding the violence that comes next.
And then the case shifts violently just weeks later. In late October, Petrus Blomgren, a 70-year-old former carpenter and farmer, is found dead. He lived a seemingly simple, deeply orderly life in the isolated village of Vilsny in Jumkill, a place of quiet, rural beauty.
And the initial crime scene analysis points to absolute brutality. Blomgren was found in his barn, killed by repeated violent blows to the head using a blunt force weapon.
A weapon they never found.
Never recovered at the scene. But despite the ferocity of the attack, the crucial element was the lack of chaos. There were no signs of forced entry, nothing seemed disturbed, and the police immediately ruled out robbery as a motive.
And the financial picture completely confirms this. Frugality and order. He had a single bank account at Förningsspar Bank.
Formerly Förnings Bank, yeah.
That he'd had since he was a child. The last withdrawal was 6 days before. A small amount, 2,000 kroner, and only 900 kroners in cash was recovered in the house. His financial life was just predictable, parsimonious.
But a man living such an orderly rural life exhibited two financial eccentricities that immediately caught the police's attention. First, his consistent monthly charitable donations to Doctors Without Borders, which he'd recently increased from 300 to 400 kronors.
And here we need to pause because we have to analyze the subtle but important police bias our sources reveal here. The investigators, looking at the victim's profile, elderly, isolated farmer, they remarked that they would have expected him to donate to Save the Children or Converting the Heathens, not an international humanitarian organization like Doctors Without Borders.
And what that comment tells us is that the police were profiling their victim not just by location and job, but by a presumed ideology. They expected local, traditional, maybe even religiously conservative charity.
Right.
So when they found a man dedicating his meager pension funds to international aid, it signaled a complexity they just weren't expecting. A private person with a big global conscience. That momentary cognitive dissonance should have opened up new lines of questioning, but instead it was just filed under unusual.
The second surprising detail was his meticulously planned will. He left almost everything to Doctors Without Borders, confirming that global focus, with just 20,000 kroner going to his neighbor, Dorotheus Fahn, and a small amount to the Jomkill Church. The man had his affairs in order, but his priorities were unexpected.
And the final, most perplexing detail was this short, cryptic note found nearby. It was oddly phrased. Detective Haver initially suspected Blomgren had written it himself to stage a suicide, but Lindell, she thought the killer had left it.
And there's one line that stuck out, right?
The line that was truly haunting, especially given the isolated beauty of the property, was, "He wanted to die, but for the tree to live." It was referencing the 100-year-old maple tree outside his house. If the killer left that, it elevates the crime from a simple revenge killing to something symbolic and deeply disturbing.
It suggests a concern for nature, or maybe a rejection of Blomgren's ability to control his own legacy. So the first murder was brutal, but the next two confirmed a terrifying pattern was emerging. We quickly moved to Jannie Lys Andersen in Alsik, followed shortly by Carl-Henrik Palmblad in Skuttunge. Both elderly, both rural, both killed by brutal, bludgeoning blows to the head, suggesting the same weapon, and still no financial motive.
Jannie Lys Andersen, also a former farmer living alone, fit the victim profile of Blomgren almost perfectly. Isolated location, meticulous life. But the crime scene showed a distinction. Andersen fought back.
He fought back.
Yeah. The kitchen was a mess. 3 chairs knocked over, a pulled-down tablecloth, and forensics confirmed a chair had been broken and used by Andersen in a desperate attempt at self-defense.
That detail is so critical. Blomgren seems to have been taken by surprise or maybe subdued quickly, but Andersen put up a significant struggle. This indicates either a change in the killer's approach or maybe Andersen recognized the killer and reacted instantly, leading to this violent, close-quarters confrontation.
And the third victim, Carl-Henrik Palmblad, in Skuttunge, he added a different layer. He was killed in his stables. Palmblad was the owner of those stables, the very place where his granddaughter, Eleanor, kept and rode her horse, Mirabelle.
So while Palmblad was elderly and rural, this victim brought the investigation slightly closer to the academic, upper-class world of horses and leisure, which, Uppsala is known for.
Exactly. We have 3 ordered lives, systematically dismantled by the same blunt force, yet police have no usable forensics and no discernible motive for theft. The killer is targeting old men with money, but leaving the money behind, so the police were just operating in a vacuum. The common threads: elderly men, lived alone in the country, former farmers for 2 of them, brutal bludgeoning, no financial motive. It all painted a picture of highly vulnerable targets. But the targets themselves were incredibly quiet people. Investigators noted they were normal people who did not take up a great deal of space.
And because they took up so little space, they left very few leads. Forensics was a complete dead end. No evidence of burglary, no identifiable footprints or car tracks on those isolated roads. And the murder weapon was never found at any of the scenes. It was almost a surgical efficiency, which, combined with the lack of obvious motive, drove the police to seek these highly complex explanations.
You just have to look at Jannie Lys Andersen's house in Alsik. It was a perfect, calculated example of parsimony. His wealth, around 1 million kroner, was neatly untouched. But the house itself was defined by this obsessive, almost pathological need for documentation.
That attention to detail is truly haunting. Our sources describe bookcases dominated by light brown folders meticulously cataloged. These folders contain receipts, vouchers, and contracts dating back decades. We're talking receipts for utility payments and, get this, even a receipt for a toaster purchased back in 1957.
And this tells us 2 things. First, these men led lives defined by absolute structure and control over their environment and their expenditures. Second, it emphasizes the killer's total lack of interest in material gain. The killer didn't smash the folders or steal the cash. The murder was the sole objective.
It was about destroying the person.
Yes. the person and the life, not benefiting from the assets. The sheer lack of evidence and the overwhelming lack of a typical motive forced the investigators to clutch at straws. Hashtag tag 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 B, the chessboard as a blueprint.
And this is where the investigation takes its jarring intellectual turn. I mean, how do you pivot from a 1957 toaster receipt to international chess? This is where Augustin Ander, an expert consultant, steps in with a theory that seems outlandish but is so detailed that it immediately takes priority.
Ander proposed that the three murders were not random, but a symbolic setup, based on a specific, famous, but ultimately pretty obscure 1930s chess match. Basque versus Antonov, played in Barcelona in 1937 against the grim backdrop of the Spanish Civil War.
That context just adds incredible gravity. The match itself was played during a moment of profound social and political chaos, giving it a certain dramatic weight, and Ander made a terrifying connection to the victim profiles.
The victim assignments were chillingly specific. Blomgren and Anderson, the farmers, were designated as the pawn's expendable pieces protecting the bigger picture. Palmblad, the owner of the stables and horses, was the knight.
So the police were convinced.
They were convinced they had a highly organized, intellectual serial killer who was using the logic of the chessboard as a blueprint for destruction.
But why did the police, particularly the higher-ups, commit so completely to this highly academic and, well, highly specific theory? Because the conclusion of that Bass versus Antonov match involved a highly successful, completely unexpected attack on the White Queen.
The fear was instantaneous and overwhelming. If the killer was truly following this blueprint, the final, ultimate target was not some old farmer. It was Queen Sylvia of Sweden. The police leadership immediately shifted resources. The idea that a highly intellectual killer was playing a grand game against the crown was deemed a legitimate existential threat.
And the sources reveal the logistical reality of this fear. Queen Sylvia's security was massively increased. She was transported by helicopter to the academic hospital for a planned visit. A formal dinner at the castle was abruptly canceled, much to the governor's fury.
Right.
The entire Uppsala police force was essentially forced to operate under the assumption that they were dealing with a mastermind, and it completely distracted them from the simple, brutal reality of the crimes themselves. It's an extraordinary example of how intellectual bias-seeking complexity, where simplicity reigns, can just derail an investigation. Hashtag tag see Lindell's isolated clues.
So while the main force was chasing the White Queen and securing the monarchy, Detective Ann Lindell, focusing on the victims themselves, was following these small, emotional inconsistencies that hinted at a personal, deeply human motive.
She revisited the Blomgren file and found the old sleeping pills prescribed in June of 1981. This was a tiny detail, but for Lindell, it was a rupture in the man's orderly life. And she used this to re-interview Dorothea Svan, the neighbor who got the 20,000 kroner.
And Dorothea finally opened up. She recalled Blomgren's trip to Mallorca in May 1981. He came back happy, she said. It suggested a significant romantic encounter. But the subsequent sleeping pills and anxiety difficulties indicated that the relationship had ended or gone sour, leaving Blomgren with some profound emotional trauma.
So that small prescription pointed not to a chess master, but to a heartbroken man.
And Lindell connected this to the other missing piece of evidence, the hidden photo. Her colleague, Alan Fredrickson, had thoroughly searched Blomgren's books, but missed a studio portrait tucked away. It was a brunette woman, probably in her 40s, with a clear inscription, "To my beloved Petrus."
The physical confirmation.
This was it, the physical confirmation of the Mallorca romance. A secret emotional life hidden from the meticulous order of his home.
And this is just a perfect example of police bias again, isn't it? The evidence of a simple, passionate, messy human life was overlooked because the focus had been on financial records and external structures. Lindell found the love story, but the investigation was still fixated on the game.
And the mystery deepens when the one piece of physical evidence that seems to confirm the chess theory surfaces, completely by accident, highlighting the tragic irony of the investigation.
I can't wait for this.
Exactly. Alan Fredrickson, the officer who missed the photo, was driving back from the L6 scene when he swerved violently to avoid a buzzard in the road. He crashed his car and ended up injured in the hospital. When they retrieved his coat from the L6 scene, the house of Annelies Anderson, the pawn victim, they found a single white pawn chess piece in the coat pocket.
Wait. Let me make sure I have this straight. An injured officer inadvertently brought back evidence from the scene that directly relates to the symbolic theory the police were chasing, but only because he crashed his car.
Precisely. The pawn was real. It was left at the scene of the pawn victim. For the police leadership, this accidental discovery was the ultimate validation of Gusten Anders' theory. The killer was following the chess match. They had the motive and the methodology confirmed.
Even though they still had no idea who the killer was or what the true emotional motive actually was.
Exactly. Lindell's emotional clues about the heartbroken Wallgren were immediately relegated to footnotes because the grand intellectual theory now had tangible evidence, even if that evidence was just a single, insignificant detail to the perpetrator.
Okay, to understand why Laura Hindersten embarked on this destructive path, we have to deeply explore the psychological environment created by her father. Our sources paint a suffocating, almost airless life in the Cobo house, characterized by intellectual control and profound emotional neglect.
Laura was psychologically trapped in two ways. First, by the expectations placed upon her being named after Petrarch's concept of perfect womanhood. And second, by the sensory environment of the professor's world. She constantly detested the mess, but especially the pervasive, stale, chemical smell that emanated from her father's reading lamp, a 60-watt model he bought in Germany in the late 50s.
That specific detail, the smell of the lamp, it's so vital. It wasn't just old electronics. That smell became the physical manifestation of her father's oppressive academic control. As he fell asleep submerged in his work, constantly surrounded by the words of Renaissance scholarship.
Her mother, Alice, was the complete antithesis of this environment. Alice came from the countryside, specifically Skytorp and Tierp, and she loved nature. She used dialect words for flowers and the landscape. Our sources mentioned she called the clover trifolium, by its other name, bee bread. She was just full of life, laughter, and natural vitality, but she was fundamentally unable to thrive in the rigid intellectual world of the Cobo house.
And we see the clash erupting in one powerful memory. Alice became furious that Ulrik loved Petrarch's obscure Tuscan dialect, yet despised her authentic Swedish country dialect. She broke into what Ulrik immediately categorized as hysterical laughter, slapped him, and retreated into silence.
And Ulrik's control was so complete that he could pathologize her grief and her rage. He just labeled it hysteria rather than acknowledging her pain.
This environment drove Laura to an extreme reaction after her father vanished. She felt an incredible feeling of liberation, and her rebellion was immediate and physical. She began aggressively cleaning up 15 years of accumulated junk, even the literal melted Citroen wreck in the driveway. She intentionally flaunted her poor taste, entertaining loud, vulgar acquaintances, and being unapologetically rude to the professor neighbors, intentionally performing the opposite of the refined image her father demanded.
But the truly defining act of freedom was the burning. Laura didn't just throw out her father's things. She systematically began burning his massive, incredibly valuable library of Renaissance scholarship. First Livius, then Petrarch, then Burckhardt.
The symbolism here is just profound. She wasn't just destroying books, she was destroying the words that her father had weaponized against her. The intellectual currency that had been used to deny her own identity and humanity.
And she described this act to herself not as vandalism, but with a sense of solemnity. She compared it to a funeral or a graduation. It was the absolute definitive destruction of her past and the ritualistic termination of the professor's control over her life. Hashtag BB. The vulnerability and the vision of escape.
So, as Laura is violently purging her past, she engages in this complicated, fraught relationship with Stig Franklin, a married colleague, and Stig is physically drawn to her intensity, but completely overwhelmed by the chaotic destruction going on around her.
Laura's behavior in these encounters is highly sexualized, but also deeply controlling. She tests Stig, pushing boundaries to see how far he'll go. Like when she offered, "You can have me here in the hall if you like," pointing to a stained mattress leaning against a wall.
Wow. This wasn't romance. It was a desperate attempt to assert agency and control in the most intimate arena. A reaction to decades of having her emotional life controlled by her father.
And Stig recognizes the fractured state of her mind. He sees her as two people in one. The brilliant, self-confident colleague he admires, and the extremely frail, delicate, almost desperate woman lying underneath. That duality made her dangerous, but also magnetic to him.
And out of this chaos emerges a vivid, almost desperate fantasy of escape. Laura isn't aiming for a general vacation. She is obsessively focused on a specific idealized refuge, a small, ramshackle harbor pub by the sea in a warm foreign country, a place where she's known, welcome, a constant patron, where the staff knows her drink and the check is never rushed.
And this fantasy is the absolute key to her psychological motivation. It represents the complete antithesis of the Cobo house and Ulrik Hindersten's world. No structure, no history, no intellectual acceptation, just acceptance and warmth. She plans to go to Palermo, Sicily, alone, and wait for Stig to join her, creating a perfect, cleansed new life dependent on the destruction of her old one. ###C.
Got
The
it.
shadow of Alice's death.
So during Lindell's early, more conversational interviews, Laura provides this offhand remark that ultimately unlocks the greatest source of her trauma. She mentions that the third step on the basement stairs is treacherous.
That single word, treacherous, is the crack in the facade. It led to the tragic revelation that her mother, Alice, died on those very stairs, falling while carrying a heavy jar of lingonberries. The third step became the physical locus of all the family's misery.
But the trauma isn't just the death, it's the lie surrounding it. Laura's cousin, Lars-Erik Johnson, later contacts her and tells her about a long-standing, horrifying rumor Ulrik Hindersten had actively spread years ago, that Laura, as a child, might have pushed Alice down the stairs.
Can you imagine the decades of abuse? Not only did she lose her mother, but her controlling father weaponized the ambiguity of the accident, making Laura feel responsible for the death. It ensured her guilt and dependence on him for her entire life. Laura violently denies this to Lars-Erik, recognizing it as Ulrik's most devastating psychological weapon.
And the final blow to her childhood narrative comes when Lars-Erik gives her a box of old letters written by Alice to his father, Morten, and these letters strongly suggest Alice and Morten were close, possibly having a long-standing affair.
This information just changes everything. It reframes Alice's death. Was she distracted, running away, or simply tired of the Cobo house? And it confirms that Ulrik was not merely a victim of his wife's loss, but a deceitful man who used a lie that Laura pushed her mother to control his daughter, while simultaneously hiding his wife's own emotional escape through a secret relationship.
So Laura's subsequent spree isn't just revenge, it's a necessary act of psychological cleansing, destroying every man connected to her father's toxic sphere of influence and the lies he constructed.
So, Detective Lindell, relying on intuition and this knowledge of Laura's troubled background, she began mapping the Hindersten house against the victims. She realized the geographic proximity was too strong to be a coincidence. The initial lead came from Jan-Elias Anderson, victim number 2, and his property in Alsike.
Right, and Sammy Nilsson confirmed the key connection. Anderson rented his cottage in Alsike to Ulrik Hindersten about 20 years ago. The timing is crucial here. It was the year after Alice died, when Ulrik was trying to escape the memories of the Cobo house and maybe test Laura's loyalty.
And Laura initially confirms this summer was the height of her childhood happiness. She remembers swinging in the pear tree, playing chess with her father, enjoying the expansive landscape reminiscent of her mother's countryside roots. It was the only time she ever felt free.
But the idol was a mask. Lindell presses her, and the true motive for Anderson's murder just erupts. Laura reveals that Anderson threw them out of the cottage because he tried to sexually abuse her as a child. He tried to fill me up. The second time I said I would tell Ulrik, that scared the old bastard.
So the murder of Jan-Elias Anderson was pure, delayed revenge for a trauma that happened on the only piece of ground where she ever felt momentarily happy, and the white pawn found at the scene. Laura confirms she took it from the chessboard they played with that summer. It was not a piece in a grand game against the queen. It was a personal, insignificant souvenir she left as a reminder of that trauma and the satisfaction of finally settling the score.
So the police wasted countless resources and jeopardized their entire investigation, chasing a sophisticated intellectual theory based on a single piece of evidence that the killer had left as a purely personal, irrelevant marker of a 20-year-old sexual assault. The complexity was fiction. The motive was simple, brutal trauma.
And the third victim, Carl-Henrik Palmblad, he also falls into place. He wasn't abused, but he was targeted for being a walking symbol of Ulrik's narcissistic world. Palmblad was known as the Horse, a loudly talking colleague of Ulrik's who had delivered this effusive, flattering, yet deeply painful speech at a dinner years earlier.
So Palmblad represented the smug, self-congratulatory academic environment that had suffocated Laura.
And Laura barely recognized him 20 years later, but "You recognize me," she admits. That recognition sealed his fate. He was killed not because of what he did to Laura, but because he was a living reminder of the pomp and arrogance that defined her father's power structure.
The three victims were just collateral damage in her war against Ulrik Hindersten's entire existence. ###be Lindell trapped.
Now knowing the full horrific truth that Laura had systematically murdered 3 men, all connected to her father's past, Lindell makes the dangerous decision to return to the Cobo house alone. She's acting on instinct to confirm her deepest suspicion. Ulrik Hindersten was not missing.
As Lindell follows Laura into the basement, she is immediately hit by a physical sensation. A pungent, bittersweet odor, a smell of decay and chemicals. In the wood storage area, Lindell finally makes the horrific discovery. Ulrik Hindersten's corpse, dressed in pajamas, wrapped tightly in plastic, and partially gnawed by rats.
He was murdered back in September.
Meaning Laura had been living alongside her father's body for months.
Laura knew she was exposed, and her reaction was instantaneous and terrifyingly symbolic. She shoves Lindell down the stairs, explicitly aiming for the treacherous third step that had killed her mother. And Laura's words are the ultimate confession. "No, you die," she screams, adding, "It was that exact step that became my mother's death."
This was not just an attempted murder, it was a ritualistic repetition of the defining trauma of her life. She was transferring the fatality of that step onto her enemy, the one person who could truly reveal her secret. Laura locks Lindell in the dark, rat-infested cellar and heads upstairs to finalize her escape plan.
Lindell is left with a brutal shoulder injury, but she maintains extraordinary presence of mind. She locates a flickering flashlight, which soon dies, forcing her into absolute darkness. She realizes the brick wine cellar offers temporary structural protection from the fire she knows is coming.
So she finds an old, inverted bathtub and uses it as a potential shield against debris.
But the truly ingenious part of her survival is the use of the wine. Knowing the smoke would kill her faster than the flames, she finds bottles of white wine, specifically a cheap brand called Peter Pan, and soaks rags in the liquid to use as a makeshift filter against the smoke. She consciously works to maintain her mental clarity, understanding that her only hope for survival should Laura return would be to talk her way out.
Lindell, the investigator of emotional trauma, was now physically trapped within Laura's physical and psychological trauma chamber. #tag Siwalesia. The queen protects herself.
While Lindell is fighting for her life underground, Laura's lover, Stig Franklin, is undergoing his own self-serving cleansing ritual. He returns to his home in Sinnersta and finally calls his wife, Jessica, admitting his infidelity and announcing his intention to leave her, believing that his experience with Laura has somehow made him a better, freer man.
But Jessica, who Stig had often treated as emotionally subordinate, executes a quiet, stunning countermove that reasserts her control. She starts selling their expensive art, the Liljephers, the Lindstrom taking back control of their shared assets. Critically, she rejects Stig's offer to pay for half the house, curtly turning down the loan, denying him the financial power to dictate the terms of their divorce.
Jessica wasn't hysterical or devastated. She was strategic. Her final move, which truly shocked Stig out of his self-pitying cleansing ritual, was to drop the emotional coldness of their marriage and confess that she still loved him. This combination of financial strength and emotional vulnerability was completely unexpected, and it just destroyed Stig's self-justification for leaving. They reconcile, perhaps shakily, but together.
And this reconciliation infuriates Laura. After Stig breaks up with her over the phone, her final, ultimate rage is directed at Jessica. Laura drives to the Sunnersta home armed with a pipe wrench, intending to kill that whore, her final rival for a future she believes she deserved.
The confrontation is brutal. Laura lunges, but Jessica remains unnervingly calm. She defends herself, not by running, but by standing firm. Laura swings the pipe wrench in a frenzy, but instead of hitting Jessica, she strikes a painting by Nils N.R. Escolt, which depicted a blooming garden.
The symbolic weight of that moment is immense. Laura, the product of decay and psychological toxicity, intended to destroy the personification of domestic order, but instead she strikes and shatters the image of natural life and growth. Laura is eventually subdued by both Stig and Jessica, who choose to stay together, denying Laura the satisfaction of destroying their life as well. #D, Aftermath, and the fire.
Laura, now completely broken, and having failed in her last act of destruction, returns to the Cobo house, sets the entire structure ablaze, and flees the scene in her new red Ford, carrying the suitcase packed for Polaro, driving toward her illusory harbor fantasy.
The emergency response is immediate. Smoke divers David Ness and Sven-Olof Andersson arrive at the burning house. Their first horrifying discovery is in the wood storage area, the rat-gnawed, pajamas-clad body of Ulrik Hindersten wrapped in plastic. The missing Professor Tace is closed. It was a murder all along.
But the second discovery is Lindell. In the wine cellar, protected by the brick structure and her own ingenuity, they find the detective under the inverted bathtub. Seriously wounded from the fall, but alive, filtered against the toxic smoke by rags soaked in cheap white wine. She's swiftly airlifted out, gravely injured, but a survivor of Laura's final, desperate act.
With the evidence now solidified, the police finally have their true suspect. Laura Hindersten, who is now the subject of a national alert, wanted for multiple counts of murder, including her father and the attempted murder of a police officer. She is the definitive serial killer they were hunting, a woman who sought freedom through total obliteration of her past. Hashtag tag outro.
So we've dissected a case where the initial investigation was dangerously derailed by an intellectual theory, the grand chess match plot chasing an imaginary threat to the monarchy. But the truth was simple, dark, and deeply personal. Laura Hindersten systematically targeted men connected to her father's power structure to settle a 20-year-old score, driven by a profound need to destroy the toxicity that defined her childhood.
And what stands out to us is the sheer incompetence bred by intellectual bias. The police prioritize the symbolic, sophisticated narrative of the White Queen threat, ignoring the concrete, emotional clues Lindell found, the hidden photo, the anxiety pills, and ultimately the real, simple meaning of the White Pawn. The chess piece wasn't a blueprint for the future, it was a relic of a traumatic past.
Deep Dive shows that when analyzing complex situations, you have to look past the elaborate structural theories and search for the personal, emotional rupture. In Laura's case, the clues were the things she was obsessed with destroying. The specialized words of her father's library, the house itself, and the men who symbolized his world. The truth was not in the grand strategy, but in the specific, treacherous third step on the basement stairs.
So what does this all mean for you, the person tasked with analyzing complex information and decision-making? Remember that often the most destructive forces are fueled not by calculated high-level planning, but by simple, decades-old wounds. You have to be willing to look past the grand plan to find the personal tragedy.
Laura Hindersten desperately sought that idealized harbor pub, that place of welcome and freedom, by engaging in acts of ultimate control and murder. But was her ultimate escape driving toward Palermo after destroying everything she knew, a genuine moment of liberation? Or was it merely the final lonely echo of her father's lifelong desire to control the narrative, forcing her life, even her crime spree, to be the most dramatic story possible?
A devastating thought on how deeply trauma can dictate destiny.